Okay, so Tana, we learned, Ota Yom, on that day, so Kuhu, they removed the Shomer HaPesach. They removed the guard who prevented people from attending the academy.
Oh.
They allowed students to come in. Anyone who wanted to come listen to the lectures, anyone wanted to come listen to the sages' teaching, were allowed to come. Ram Galil used to announce the Kol Talmud She'ein Tocho Kavaro. Any student whose inside is not like his outside, which means to say, who isn't as sincere and pious as he looks, lo yikones lebeis hamedrash, should not come in to the house of study. In other words, he did not allow. He had to personally vet to make sure people were genuinely as pious as they pretended to be. They had to be as pious and as holy and as good as they presented themselves.
So it's nothing to do with brain power.
Yeah, no. Even if you were knowledgeable, you had to prove you were sufficiently from.
Yeah.
So they removed a source of kamas of solid. So on that day, many benches were added to the Beis HaMedrash, many chairs, because all of a sudden you had all these hundreds of people who could come in. And the idea is that Rabbi Gamliel's idea is we have to save Judaism by only allowing the best and brightest and holiest in. And the Chachamim held, no. The way we save Judaism is we let everyone possible come in to learn, and the more people who learn and the more people who know, the safer Judaism will be.
Yeah.
And that opinion won. Rabbi Yosef ben Distoy and the rabbis argued about how many benches were added. There were 400 chairs added, and one says 700 chairs were added, 700 places. So it's a lot of students who were able to come in.
It had to be a very huge hall or something.
Yeah, Kachol should die to the Rabbi Gamliel. Rabbi Gamliel felt bad. Omar says, "Dilma chas v'shalom anati Torah miYisrael." Maybe I kept Torah away from the Jewish people because all of a sudden there's 700 more students. Ochzalei b'chalma, they showed him in a dream chatz v'chivri, white earthenware containers full of ashes, the Mullion Kitna. In other words, they had a dream and there were all these beautiful containers full of ashes, showing that the new students weren't anything to write home about. That he had a dream in which he saw these white containers, beautiful containers full of ashes. In other words, they look nice, but there's nothing there. So don't feel bad, Rabbi Gamliel.
Oh, ashes means nothing.
Yeah. So don't feel bad because you didn't these weren't worthwhile people. The Gemara says below here, it's not the case. They really was good to have them there. He had the dream because from heaven they wanted him not to feel bad because he was torturing himself. But really the truth was he had kept Torah away from the Jewish people. But they just didn't want him to feel too bad because he was a good man. So from heaven they showed him that he shouldn't feel bad. Now, and whenever it says Bo Bayom, that day, that is the day that they let everyone into the Beit HaMedrash. And as we'll see later, Rabbi Gamliel himself, even though he was deposed as leader, continued to come. In other words, he accepted the opinion of his fellows who removed him, and he continued to participate just as an ordinary student, to show you that everything he did was for the sake of heaven, and he accepted the majority opinion of his fellows, as we'll see soon. So you see, when Jews have a revolution, they argue. They don't shoot the old guy. They don't have fist fights. They just argue. That's a Jewish revolution.
Bo Bayom.
Now, Tana, we learned whenever it says Bo Bayom, that day, that's the day they let all these new people into the Beis HaMedrash. So Tana, we learned Idios, the tractate Idios, Bo Bayom Nishmas, was taught on that day. So let me explain. Idiot is a very interesting tractate. It's called the Becherta. Remember we learned earlier Becherta, the choicest learning? Idiot is very interesting.
How do you spell it?
Ayin Dalet means testimony, aid.
Aid.
Yeah. In other words, it's a tractate of no particular topic. It's in the Zikin. It's a short tractate. And it's testimonies. It's testimonies collected from people who were around at the end of the Second Temple period. Because the Mishnah is a collection of discussions that took place from about 50 of the Common Era until about the year 220, 230. Okay? But the Mishnah, it's, in other words, from the time of Hillel and Shammai on. That's what the Mishnah is. It's a collection of discussion.
The Midrash is long gone.
Yeah, but it started the Mishnah. But the point is that in the time of Rabban Gamliel, which is like 30 years after the destruction of the temple, about the year 100, there were people alive, old people who remembered the temple. So idiot are testimonies from people who were great sages, who remembered how things were taught in the Sanhedrin before the Sanhedrin was disbanded. Before the Sanhedrin was disbanded 40 years before the destruction of the temple.
Say it again.
The Sanhedrin was disbanded 40 years before the destruction of the temple.
40 years before.
About the year 25, okay? This takes place maybe not 100, but the year 90, 80 or 90.
Why was it disbanded?
Because they didn't want the Romans to control them. So they left. When the Sanhedrin is not in Lishkas Agazas, it doesn't have power to make decisions, and they didn't want to be controlled by the Romans or the Herodians or any of those people. Because there was political pressure on them. They didn't want to be subject to political pressure. Anyways, so this is taking place maybe not 100, but the year 80 or 90. Okay? So if we're talking about the year 90, and the Sanhedrin was disbanded 75 years before, 60 years before, there were people in their 80s and 90s who remembered the great Chachamim, who remembered things the Sanhedrin ruled on before it was disbanded, things that took place in the temple before it was disbanded. And Ediot are the testimonies from that earlier time. And that day, when they opened up the Beit HaMedrash, various people came and testified as to what they saw take place before the disbandment of the Sanhedrin. But then that's why Ediot is called Bechir to the choice, because it represents a direct oral tradition from the last time there was a Sanhedrin, from the last time there was a Beit HaMikdash. So tractate Ediot was taught on that day. V'chol heichen, anywhere in Braita where it says Bo Bayom, that day, Hahu Yom Hav, it's that day when the doors of the was open. There was no halacha that was hanging, no halacha they hadn't been able to solve that wasn't solved that day. Why? Because by adding all these students and adding all these voices and hearing all these new ideas and discussions, the much bigger discussion enabled them to come to conclusions and solve problems that have remained solved for many years. In other words, when you let a lot more voices into the base of Medrash, you get better results.
Sounds like a miracle.
Rabbi Gamliel, and even Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Gamliel did not hold himself back from coming to the base of Medrash even 1 hour. Even though he had been deposed, and you'd think he'd be angry or upset or embarrassed, he accepted the decision of his colleagues. And look, he had to study Torah. So Rabbi Gamliel came and participated like everyone else from the benches, even though he had been deposed. And look, Rabbi Gamliel was in his 70s then, and they put some 18-year-old in his place, and he accepted his rulership. And
Rabbi Lazar?
Yeah. So we see Rabbi Gamliel, everything he did was for the sake of heaven. In other words, it wasn't about his power, and that he accepted his colleagues' decision.
I can just imagine what was going on there.
It's non, we learned in the Mishnah. Baby, it was like Nebrak. Baby, that day. Bo Yehuda. So that day, how do we know Rabbi Gamliel was in the base of Medrash? Because Bo Bayom, whenever it says in a Braita, Bo Bayom means that day that they deposed Rabbi Gamliel and opened the doors of the base of Medrash. So Bo Bayom that day, Bo Yehuda Geramoni Lifneyan the base of Medrash. So there was a man named Yehuda who was an Ammonite ger. If you remember, it says Ammoni Moabi, a male, not a female, but a male Ammoni, and a male Moabi is not allowed to enter into Kal Hashem. So Yehuda was someone who lived in the land of Ammon, which is southern Jordan today. Amman, the capital of Jordan, is a very old city. It was originally called Rabat B'nai Ammon, the chapter of the great city of Ammon. And there's also a city named Rabat in Jordan. Anyways, so Yehuda lived in Jordan, what's today Jordan. He lived in Transjordan. And he came and said can I enter the kahal? In other words, you could a Ammonite can convert, but he can only marry another convert. Can't marry a born Jew because of the Torah's prohibition. Amalei Rabban Gamliel, who's always toughy, says, Osar Tolavol Bakol. You're not allowed to come into the kahal. You're an Ammonite. An Ammonite may not marry a born Jew. You cannot enter the community of Israel. Amalei Rabbi Yeshua says, Mutar Tolavol Bakol. You can marry anyone you want. Welcome. Amalei Rabban Gamliel said, who typically argued with Rabbi Yeshua, V'lo Kvar Nemar, does it not say in the Torah itself, let an Ammonite, a Moabite, may not enter the congregation of the Lord. Amalei Rabbi Yeshua says, are today's Ammonites and Moabites the same Ammonites and Moabites, the tribe you're not allowed to marry into because they didn't greet the Jewish people with bread and water when they were in the desert? Kvar Ola Sancherev Melech Asher, Sancherev, the king of Asher, came ubilbol at kol ha'umot and mixed together all the nations, because the Assyrians, Sancherev, when the Assyrians conquered, right? So when the Assyrians conquered much of the Middle East, much of the Near East, Middle East, every nation they conquered, they moved them to another country, because people tend to rebel when they're in their own country and on their own land. So he came and he mixed everyone up. He moved this one here and this one there. And therefore, the people who live in what's today Jordan are not the original Ammonites and Moabites. Because, and the commentaries explain, once Sancherev moved all these nations around, so other nations came in and they pushed out other nations. He had a big washing machine. So no nation is living in the same, no nation in the Middle East, because no nation around Israel is in the same place as it was in the times of the Torah. Shenemar, as it says, indeed, as it says in Yeshayahu, v'asir gevulos Amin, that Yeshayahu predicts the coming of Sancherev, and he says he will destroy the borders of nations. Vasidisayim shosti v'ored ka'aver yoshvim, and Vasidisayim and their future he will destroy, and he will come like a mighty one among their dwellers. Which means to say, he'll take all the borders and nations and crush them and move them around, mix and match, and no one is living in the same place. V'chol de parish meruba parish. Now, the rule is that anyone, even though some of the original inhabitants may remain, the rule is in kashrus and everything else, whatever separates comes from the majority. So if you have 10 pieces of meat that get piled together, and 2 are treif and 8 are kosher, and they all look the same, if you pull one out of the pile, we assume it's kosher, because whatever separates comes from the majority. So too here, he mixed everyone up. Now, is it true that some Ammonites and Moabites probably remained where they were or came back? Yeah. But since the majority of people are from other tribes, the rule is anytime you take one individual out of a group, you assume that it comes from the majority. The majority of people living in Ammon and Moab are not genetic descendants of the Ammonites and Moabites.
This, by the way, I want you to know, was the system Stalin used. And as a matter of fact, the Ukrainian war now is a result of some of that.
Yeah.
He moved the Russians into Ukraine.
And the Poles.
Says, just like Hitler says.
Yeah.
He played the same game.
Right. Doesn't Yirmiyah say that after all of the suffering, I shall return the captives of Ammon to their place, so they already returned. In other words, the Ammonites came back because Hashem said, I'll bring back the Ammonites to their place. Amalei Rabbi Yeshua, no. Rabbi Yeshua told him, doesn't it say in Amos, Beshavti Yeshvus Ami Yisrael, when Amos talks about the 10 tribes, I will return the captives of my nation Israel. Did they return? Did the Adayin Lo Shavu? They didn't return yet. In other words, the same way Hashem predicts will return the captives of the 10 tribes, and they haven't come back yet. So to the captives of Ammon. In other words, when will the captives of Ammon come back? When the 10 tribes come back, when Mashiach comes. And until Mashiach comes, they haven't come back. So whoever lives in Jordan is not an Ammonite. There may be a few Ammonites, but they're not an Ammonite because whoever separates comes from the majority. Miyadi tirul avobako. Everyone, they voted, and the academy voted and agreed to let him enter the community. In other words, Rabbi Yeshua won. Rabbi Gamliel says, since I see that the majority agrees with Rabbi Yeshua, especially with all the new students, I see Rabbi Yeshua is right. I'm going to ask him for forgiveness because it's clear I was wrong in making Rabbi Yeshua agree with me, because it seems that the majority agrees with him. So he's right and I'm wrong. So I should go apologize to him. Because if you remember, he tried to force Rabbi Yeshua on 3 occasions to agree with him. And he realizes now that the majority agrees with Rabbi Yeshua, as we saw in this exchange about an Ammonite and Moabite. And by the way, the same thing applies to Egyptians.
So how can we are reading in the Torah and it says, Ammoni lo yabo b'kal whatever. Here we're discussing that, there's a whole bigger discussion and it's never discussed unless you study it here.
It's also in Shulchan Aruch, by the way.
Oh.
It's in the Code of Jewish law. Yeah, this is the halacha. The halacha is like Rabbi Yeshua. That's the time
then to bring it in. Otherwise, you'd think.
No, but that's why, for example, it says an Egyptian has to wait 3 generations before they can marry in.
Right.
But today, if an Egyptian converts to Judaism, they let him in right away. Why? Because even though some of the people in Egypt are descended from the ancient Egyptians.
So we do the same thing with everything.
Every nation, yeah. There's no Amalekites. There's no one who's in their original place anymore.
I know. So we are changing our rules against them.
We're not changing it. Let me explain to you. Because when the Torah speaks about a nation, it's genetic. When the Torah speaks about Ammon or Moab or Mitzrayim or Edom or Amalek, it's genetic. In other words, it's the family of Ammon, the family of Moab.
Yeah.
It's the people, not the land. If another genetic group comes and lives in that land, or they mix up with the other people who lived there before. So there are people in Egypt who have ancient Egyptian DNA, but there's lots of Arabs and other people. Since it's all mixed together, there's no more prohibition. Like you're supposed to destroy Amalek. Who's Amalek? I don't know. They got scattered all over the world. We have no idea who Amalek is. You know what I mean?
What about especially when they accepted Islam later on?
Yeah.
What?
Yeah, but the point is it's genetic. The nations in the Torah that you're allowed to marry, not to marry, that you have to destroy, not destroy, are genetic. It's families. The family of Canaan, the family of Esau, the family of Ammon. So once those families are no longer in their original place or they're mixed up with other people, none of those laws apply. Because when the Torah talks about a people, it's not talking about territory, it's talking about genetics.
But do
you have to go through a DNA test?
No, you don't, because the assumption is that none of the nations are intact in their original place, except the Jews, because we keep good track of ourselves. And therefore, all the rules that say an Ammonite can't enter, an Egyptian has to wait 3 generations, you have to wipe out the Canaanites, none of that applies anymore, because all the nations have been mixed together and shake and bake. So there's no independent, no nations that are in the same place as they were when the Torah was given. The only nation that remains intact throughout all the generations is the Jewish people. Because like even the Chinese, there's a lot of different Oriental strains mixed in there, and the Mongols came and the Manchus came. It's a challenge.
Yeah.
But and we have a lot of converts. It's true. But if you look at actually, it's interesting. If you look at Jewish DNA tests, Ashkenazim, Sephardim, and so on, there's a very, very high percentage of that original Middle Eastern genome. Like Yemenites and Ashkenazim are very similar genomes. Like I did a test, I am 99.96% Ashkenazic Jewish.
Not only that, they say the same thing about our...
Yeah, and the 0.004% is Berber. So that means there's some Moroccan convert somewhere in my background.
How about what's going on in society now about intermarriage and things?
So the answer is, for example, if you did a genetic test on the Satmar Hasidim, you'd find they have a lot of Slavic and Magyar in them, because the Satmar are descended from a part of Hungary. There were a lot of converts in the very early Middle Ages before those places became Christian. The reason I mention this is that a convert is a Jew the same as any other Jew, and someone with a Jewish mother is a Jew no matter what. It's halachic. However, the issue with intermarriage isn't genetic. In other words, I know someone, my sister actually knew someone who was only 128th Jewish, but she was halachically Jewish.
Why?
Because her mother's mother in the 18th century was Jewish. The story is, I'll tell you the story before we finish for today. Now, this is the last shiur because Sunday we don't learn, and I will be away. This is the last shiur until Tuesday, like 12 days from now. In other words, we resume at the end of July. We're sending out an email, but
you are going to be gone all of next week.
I'm going to be gone all of next week, starting Monday.
Not Sunday, Monday.
Monday, and I'm coming back. And I'm coming back for Tuesday morning, 8 days later. Because I'm going to be
to Tuesday.
Yeah, so,
Tuesday.
So I'm going to be gone. I'm going to be gone starting Monday the 18th, days. And I will return on the
Tuesday.
I'll return on Tuesday. I'll tell you, it's 8 days. So it's 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 20. Yeah. So I will return on the 26th. And you'll probably see me here on the 27th. And I'll be gone for Shabbos.
Miss my breakfast on Tuesday.
I'm sorry. Well, maybe I'll be back earlier. Who knows? And unfortunately, there's things going on in the community. I may have to come back for various things.
So
I'm not going overseas.
I want to mention this. So on one hand, we still say the 10
there'll be an
tribes,
email on this. No, but let me tell the story. Let me tell you the story. So the story is that and you'll hear this from me before. My sister, as a very young woman, Rabbi Friedman used to run a summer program for like kids who, college kids who had no Jewish background for women, young women, college students in Minnesota. It's called Beis Chana. And it was basically a program for people with no Jewish learning background who wanted to learn about their Judaism. And my sister was a counselor there. And there was a young woman there who came because she was studying to convert. She grew up in a small town deep in rural Georgia, very far from Atlanta and so on. And since she was a little child, she had this tremendous interest in Judaism, even though there were no Jews in her town. So in college, once she was a little bit free, she started exploring Judaism and found an Orthodox rabbi to convert with. And he suggested she come to Beis Chana for the summer. So Rabbi Friedman was very intrigued. Manis Friedman, a well-known figure, was very intrigued by this interest. Where does it come from? Usually people do Judaism, they meet a Jew, they know Jews, like in Brooklyn, you have converts, right? Where did this come from? Like there were several African-American families who grew up in the 60s in Crown Heights who were very intrigued by the Jews around them and converted. Anyway, so what happens? So he says, why don't you look at your ancestry? So she says, yeah, my mother's a daughter of the American Revolution. Our female line goes all the way back. And, and she starts looking back, and the ancestor who gave them, who was alive and participated in the revolution, the female ancestor had a Spanish last name. So Rabbi Friedman says, you look at this genealogy, this person may have been Jewish. And they investigated, turned out she was the daughter of a Jewish merchant who married a non-Jew and converted to Christianity. So this was the mother's mother, going back.
Even though she was a Christian.
Yeah, but she was born a Jew. So she was, the point is this took place about 1985, okay? So we're talking someone who lived in 1785, who died in 1785. So that's like 5 generations, which makes her half, quarter, 8th, 16th, 32nd, 64th. So she was 1/64th Jewish. Hitler would not have considered her a Jew. But if halacha, she was much as a Jew as the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Because her mother's mother. So Rabbi Friedman said, you don't have to convert. So the custom is, in such a case, when someone's been away from Judaism many generations, they go to the mikveh and accept their re-entry into the Jewish people. But it's not a conversion. So
they should, because.
So my point is, because halacha says.
Grandfather did.
No, but right, grandmother did. Men are irrelevant to being Jewish. Only women count. Men don't count. Men don't count. Only women count.
Take somebody like Madeleine Albright. From Czechoslovakia.
She was 100% Jewish.
Both of her parents were Jewish.
Yeah, but you
She schmadzich.
No, the father, they didn't want to practice Judaism, and her excuse was that she didn't know.
So how about her descendants?
Her children are Jewish.
They're Jewish.
Her children are as Jewish as Moshe Rabbeinu.
Oh, really?
And if she has any daughters, her children are Jewish too. Yeah. But at any rate,
considered Jewish, or are they actually?
Al pi halacha in other words, it makes no difference if you think you're Jewish. If you're the Pope and your mother's Jewish, you're a Jew no matter what. In other words, you can't ever stop being a Jew. Why? Because a Jew is not someone who chose to be a Jew. It's Hashem chose you. And even if you're a convert, once you convert to Judaism properly, according to halacha, that demonstrates that Hashem chose you to be a Jew.
But how come we had this big discussion in Israel when the
Russians,
Ethiopians,
when cardinal, like the Cardinal of Paris, which was 100% Jewish, he came to Israel. He said, "I'm Jewish," and there was a big thing. You are cardinal.
Okay, so let me tell you. So it's the famous Father Daniel episode in 1954.
Yeah,
there was a fellow who converted to Christianity and wanted to come to Israel under the law of return. So the Israeli government said that even though halachically he's Jewish, since he practices another religion, we're not bringing him in. That's a government choice. That's a separate issue, and that's the point. In other words, there's a difference. A person could be a very bad Jew. A person could have shmadzach, which you're supposed to give your life rather than convert out of Judaism, but he's still a Jew. No one can stop being a Jew because God, you don't define. No human being defines who a Jew is. Hashem defines who a Jew is.
Okay, but the state of Israel is...
The state of Israel has the right to decide who they want to give money to. You get a lot of privileges when you immigrate.
I think any Jew that from around the world that comes to Israel, you automatically...
Right, but if you're practicing another religion, they won't admit you as a Jew.
So
that's the government's choice.
Political.
Exactly, yes. Political Judaism. On the other hand, someone who has 3 Jewish grandparents is admitted to Israel, even though they're not halakhically Jewish, because the mother's mother is not Jewish. Israel has its own systems that don't necessarily match Jewish law. As a matter of fact, they used to say that a Jewish grandparent is a locomotive because it schleps the whole Goyish or Russian family to Israel. No, because there was a time, anyways. But be that as it may, nowadays, there are no Ammonites, Moabites, no Egyptians. And when we meet again, when I come back, we'll discuss what happened when Rabbi Gamliel went to seek forgiveness from Rabbi Yeshua. It's a very powerful piece of social commentary that I quote often.
Came across a lot of this when the Iron Curtain opened up.
Have a good Shabbos.
All the Russians started coming in.
Have a good Shabbos, Michal. And Mazel Tov and all that. By the way, the gentleman, our friend Michal, his son is getting married soon. So we should give him a Mazel Tov. Michal's the gentleman who joins us for learning every day, all the way from Maryland. So you can all tell him Mazel Tov.
Mazel Tov to what?
Michal's son is getting married soon.
Oh.
Where are they from?
Maryland, Silver Spring. Yeah.
No, but he's getting married where?
In Maryland, no?
Oh, in
Baltimore.
Baltimore, yeah. Mazel Tov, Mazel Tov.
Mazel Tov. Mazel Tov.
Mazel Tov.